Okay, here's some feedback on the assessing at different levels of cognition assignment and some direction for the next assignment. So some things to consider. First, going forward, I want to make sure that everyone understands that you actually have to make the assessment. In this case, I didn't really care that much. I just wanted to see what you would do. Descriptions gave me an idea of where you were leaning, but the devil is often in the details. So going forward, I want to make sure that all assessments are actually made as you would give them to the students. So put a name or spot for the name up on the top, include directions, things like that. We're going to be sticking to single pages for now because there are just too many students in the different classes for me to do more. So that's what we're going to be. So one page going forward. This example, again, does give me a good idea of what strategy would be used to assess, but I can't really see how it would be implemented. And that's really where we are going to, especially with all the different rules and so on. A second thing is make sure you keep it at the right level of cognition. Now, a lot of times what happens is you have a recall goal that accidentally gets turned into a comprehension or application item, or vice versa, where you have a higher level goal that gets turned into a lower level goal. So this was for goal number 2. It was supposed to be at a comprehension level. And some of them are, or are at least borderline. So like question 1, name one way that the missionaries changed the lives of the native people. I could see, depending on what you're looking for, this could be a comprehension question, but because the whole definition of convert is to change, that's really getting really close to recall. What did the missionaries teach the native people to do? That again could be borderline. What types of animals were introduced, though, is a pure recall kind of question. There's a little graphic in there, and you can see the types of animals that are in there. They're also mentioned in the text. That is pure recall. And then how did the missionaries treat the native people? There are, again, some versions of an answer that could be recall. There are some versions that could be comprehension. And you want to make sure that if you are assessing at the comprehension level, that you cannot answer it in a meaningful way with a recall type question. When it comes to formatting, one of the things I want you to do, and there's a lot of ways you can format things, but I want you to consider space and ease of modifying things. So if you have things like this, match each vocabulary word with the correct definition from the text. Here, you can have letters here, and then you can look down and write whatever letter is next to, and let me actually just put some letters in there. So I can do that, and that's all fine and dandy. Another option that people do is having boxes with arrows, and this works really well if you don't have that many terms. But if you get a lot of terms, and knowing how kids tend to write and erase and so on, it can get hard unless you want to make a pattern that's really easy for you to identify. And this one's pretty good. The correct pattern is going to be pretty good, but you still will have to check all of the answers to make sure that they are right or wrong. One of the other things that we'll talk about is that we want to make sure that the longer stuff is first and the shorter stuff is second. So this stuff should really be on the top, and then the term should have the letters next to their name, so they just have to write the letter. It cuts down on reading time, and that ultimately is a stability reliability issue. You don't want them to get fatigued. You don't want them to get lost and forget what word they were looking for as they read through the definitions, especially if you are functioning at a comprehension or application level within a matching format. One of the things that if you do something like this, make sure that you use the grouping function where you highlight everything, and then there's a grouping menu where you can group things. It makes your life a lot easier if you're not familiar with it. One of the most successful ways to do this is by putting it in a table. And let me just show the grid lines here so you can see what it is. This is just a table, a 4x5 table, and then you can mess around with the borders and stuff. You can justify things either at the top or the bottom. You can center them, do whatever you want. But ultimately, you can, once you make it this way, you can hide all those other borders. You'll want to keep the borders for the blanks for them to write the letters in. And the nice thing about this is that it can be all moved around. If you find you're running out of space or you want to resize it, make it smaller, you can do that, narrower, wider, whatever you want to do. You can do it pretty easily, and that is a huge benefit rather than if a lot of people type them in rows, and it's really easy for formatting to get all messed up in that way. Another issue is considering what you're measuring. So in this case, creating a timeline and identifying 4 key events, including the year that it happened. 2 things with this one. One, I want to make sure that you use the goals that I send you. It's really good if you end up making your own goals, and I will be having you do that for the final version of this assignment. We have a couple iterations to go through. But for now, I want you to use the goals that I give you, because that way it gives me something to show you back in terms of feedback as a whole class. If everyone does different things, that becomes harder to do. And I also want to make sure that the goals function and bring up some certain issues that they typically do if we include certain materials and certain levels of cognition together. Sometimes that messes with what formats work and what formats don't. The second thing here is that when we look at what's going on here, creating the timeline and identify 4 key events, including the year that it happened. An example is below, right? So one, this seems to be an application task, not about the content, but about creating a timeline. Because if they're looking at the materials and they're just looking for dates that are in bold and then arranging it, the real application task is arranging dates on a timeline. And that's not one of the goals that I had. I don't know if it's the goal that the person intended. I'm not sure. But this would be fine if that was a timeline-centered goal. But if it's about mastering the content or recalling dates and times and events, then it doesn't quite work. Likewise, for this assessment, students will be given a map of the world with blanks pointing to different lines and places. Students will then be given a word bank like this: South Pole, longitude, Cuba, and so on. Students will have to put these words in the right places on the map. Now this again the goal was to apply latitude and longitude to different locations. And this gets you at whether or not they know what the longitude and latitude things are. But otherwise, it's just labeling things on a map. And so that is a different objective than using latitude and longitude to identify specific locations. So those are some general rules to remember. Make sure you actually make the assessment using the goals that I give you. Keep it at the right level of cognition. Work through formatting so you don't take up a ton of space and you keep things arranged in a way that is recommended by the rules. And then finally, make sure that you are measuring the specific skill you want and not having a construct validity issue where you start measuring a bunch of other stuff. So that brings us to goal 1. Goal 1, a lot of people went with matching, and that is a good way to go. It works in this case, and a lot of people went this route where we have the different terms and the definitions. Now, if we're thinking about the matching rules, 1, these should be on the left, these should be on the right. We also shouldn't necessarily have exact matches because that makes the guessing parameter a lot easier. We have to ask ourselves if this is a homogeneous list or not, and this is, so we're fine on that case. The other thing is that you should tell them what you're supposed to be doing here. If there are no letters for them to write, I don't know if I'm supposed to draw lines, write letters, circle things, make sure the directions are clear in describing exactly what needs to be done. A lot of people went with short answer, or having students write the definition. So to find each of the following, students can write the definition that they've memorized or out of the text. And even if they put in their own words, that's fine because they are going above the level of cognition and not below. But you can answer this with a recall level answer. This works fine. The drawback is that it takes a little bit longer for them to write, and then it will take you a lot longer to grade because you will have to read a lot of messy penmanship and make some judgment calls about whether something is right or wrong when it's kind of borderline or worded kind of funny. A different version of short answer, and this is much more what I would recommend, is that you give them a definition and they supply the term. Now, if you do that and you supply a word bank, then it turns back into a matching situation. So if you want to stick with the short answer format that eliminates the issue of guessing, you can go this route, but it takes them a lot less time to write one word rather than a sentence. It also takes you a lot less time to grade, and I want you to consider that, in a big way, because that's where all the time goes. Multiple choice. This, again, makes a lot of sense in these cases. It's not economical in terms of the amount of paper you would use. You can compact this a lot more into a matching, and if you are going to do a matching like this, where you actually have extra terms, you basically end up getting the benefits of multiple choice without having to write out and format everything in a particular way. It's much more efficient in terms of space and students having to read through a bunch of different things. However, benefits of multiple choice, in this case, if I did have common misconceptions, I could change my options so I could identify how many students were making common mistakes. In the case of recall definitions, though, that doesn't really play a role into it. I'm not really worried that students are going to get like peninsulare and encomienda mixed up, or society and missionary. I'm not worried about systematic errors like that. But any one of these options can be used. I would say that for this particular goal, the matching, if it's formatted correctly with additional options, is the most efficient way to go. Goal 2. A lot of people went with essays here, and goal 2 was all about how the missionaries changed the lives of the natives. There are 3 options here. A couple good things about each one. One, this specifies what you want them to discuss, so that's really good. You want to give some guidance. This one gives a specific number, which is great. And this one gives a specific length, which is also great. Now, all 3 of those things could be combined. Because it's a comprehension level goal, this is totally warranted. If it was an essay at a higher level, and we'll get to this later on, we wouldn't want this much scaffolding or this much structure. You'll want it to be a little more open-ended to see if those structures exist in the students' heads. Another format that people can use is a hybrid of some sort, where you have multiple tasks that kind of break down a more complex task and make it easier for you to grade. The thing I like about this one is that you're getting at this idea of some things maybe were good from one person's perspective and some were bad from some people's perspectives. In this case, one of the things would have to be added was from whose perspective. From the missionary's perspective, it was all good, right? From the native's perspective, maybe it was mostly bad, if not all bad. So that's something that you do need to specify. Once you're done making your list, if you want to decide if you think missionaries changed the lives of the natives in a positive or negative way, then write a short paragraph using the ideas from your list to defend your decision. So in this case, I like this because you get some diagnostic information about what do students remember and what do they think about whether it was positive or negative. Then you get some more argumentation later on. Another way that you could go about this in terms of comprehension, much faster, the drawbacks of essays in both, or all 4 of these cases, are that they will take the students a significant time to write, and they will take you even longer to grade. So you can get at comprehension with all the select type formats as well. And this is one way you can do it, as long as these are not verbatim or word for word out of the text. So some of these, like converted them to Catholicism, that's pretty close to word for word. Provided protection, I think, is more conceptual based on how I remember that particular chapter. And so you'd have to just make sure that these were all at the comprehension level. And none of them are word for word. Some of them are pretty close. You just want to make sure that they are as far away from pure recall as you can get them to be. But otherwise, this is a very efficient way to go about it. Finally, we have multiple choice. And one of the things about this is that you want to make sure that you bold, underline, or capitalize the false, making sure that they are highly tuned to the fact that they're not looking for a true statement. It's very easy for people to make that mistake because they're usually looking for the true statement. And then we have a bunch of things going down here with B as the right answer. This can work. It's having just a single question is somewhat limited in the whole kind of measuring all the details of what that comprehension amounts to. So if you don't go with an essay, which is time consuming, you do have to at least target multiple ideas like here in order to get a more accurate reading about where your students are at. Now for goal number 3, one of the most common things with application type questions in general is that sometimes some of the essential information is left out of the question itself, and you're requiring students to use other materials that make copying and cheating a little more likely. So an example like this, coordinates can be often used to find locations of places on Earth. Use a line of the globes to find coordinates, and then find the coordinates of Hispaniola and Cuba. Now this is pretty good depending on what level of detail is on that globe. Having students use their own globe, if all students had their own globe, would work. Having them all get up and go to the globe in the classroom wouldn't. That would be kind of a disaster. If they had a computer-based globe, that would work too. But then you have to run the risk of them just typing in what are the coordinates of Hispaniola and Cuba. You also have a question about precision. And like in this case, you have these different degrees, and you can see that multiple degrees are going through Hispaniola and Cuba. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what is the right answer? Providing them with different options is one way to get around that. So having a picture like this and a multiple choice question like this is a good way to go. I would also warn about the amount of detail that, they're going to go to whole degrees at a minimum, and maybe even rounding in some cases, if it works, to whole numbers or, tens, fives, things like that, to make sure that 1, there's only one right answer, and 2, that it's contained somewhere in that particular location. Making sure that you have different options. And what I like about this one is that, right, there's 20 and 72 here. This would be the other version. And what you're trying to test here is if they know about the North and the West. I would probably also change these two to 72 degrees instead of, instead of 72 degrees north and south. I would make sure to put that information in there too. I'd have to make sure that it was in my handout. But I would give them the right coordinates. I would mix them up, especially if it is an image that is as simple as this. I might want to go with something a little bit broader like this, And then again, I can either have them write it in, but that gives me this whole problem of I have to keep double checking whether things are right. Better for me to give a list of what are the latitude coordinates and give them a bunch of options. What are the longitudinal coordinates? Give them a bunch of options. Have them indicate whether it's north, south, east, or west as another part of it. And then that gives me all the information without having to worry about precision, going back and forth, and whatnot. This also gives me a larger perspective, so I can throw some other things on there that might not even make sense, but that is completely up to you. So that leads me to this next assignment. This week we are going to be going into supply type items, short answer and essays. I want you to watch the videos outlining the ins and outs of all those, and there are some sample critique items and critique answers there for you as well. No quiz associated with that, but there are items there with answers that you can review. If you are in 424, what I will want you to do is create a one-page assessment using only select type items. So using what we've talked about this past week. You can do matching, multiple choice, or true and false, all in the one format. So you have to pick one of those. Can't mix and match among those. I want you to use the following goals. First, review the following video on selecting a format for assessing, and this goes through how I make that decision process. Why would I choose one over the other? For part 2, you're going to be looking at that third lesson in the science material about conservation, or how humans affect the ecosystems of the world. I want you to focus on 2 different goals. First, students will be able to define unit terms: reclamation, conservation, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And we're going to put this at the recall level. Students will be able to identify which conservation strategy, reduce, reuse, recycle, is most effective in a given situation. This is going to be application, meaning that you will have to give them some kind of scenario and they will have to decide whether recycling, reducing, or reusing is most appropriate for whatever it is that's going on there. Up to you to decide how many you need, what they look like, and so on. As a final thing, I will also want you to insert a comment that provides a short justification about why you chose what you chose, why you chose multiple choice, true, false, or matching, along with describing what are the benefits and liabilities, or the pros and cons. I'll add that here. I would say that one paragraph is more than enough to make your case about why you think matching, multiple choice, or true and false is most appropriate for whatever it is that you're going to use. Assume that your class size is 30 students, and that does matter. If you are in the secondary class, I will want you to redo your lesson assessment from lesson 1 using only select type formats. Make sure that you limit your assessments to a single page. Provide a short justification of why you chose the format you did as well. Now, along with these things, I want you to identify which goal you're assessing for each set of items, and I will want to make sure that you keep it formatted in the way that you would actually give it to your students. So make sure that there's a spot for their name, directions are clearly labeled, and all that sort of stuff. If you have any questions on that, please let me know, and I would be more than happy to give you some more guidance.